Welcome back, Year 12, to your biology lesson this afternoon. As you recall, what we did this before lunch, this is for the benefit of Amin and Tarek, because they're not here obviously, so we're just making sure we're just recapping on that. So we started chapter 7 on hemoglobin, right? So hemoglobin is a quaternary structure made from 4 polypeptide chains. It's got the primary structure, which is coiled to make a coil, so there's a secondary structure. Then it goes on to the folds. The coils fold on themselves with ionic bonds, the ionic bonds, the hydrogen bonds, and the disulfide bridges. They coil on themselves and they make the tertiary structure. And then the definition of quaternary structure is that they connect together. So you've got multiple tertiary structures, you get the quaternary structure. And the beauty of hemoglobin is that it can actually change shape, so it can open or close. So it's a reversible reaction, but what can happen is each hemoglobin can actually join into 4 oxygen molecules, and when it binds onto oxygen, it makes oxyhemoglobin. And so this is the reaction here. We'll move on to the next one. What do we know? The blood is a red colour because it contains iron. When oxygen binds to it, when red blood cells have oxygen binding to it, it becomes a brighter red, and when the oxygen comes off it, it becomes a darker red. The word associate means when oxygen binds onto the hemoglobin, and when oxygen comes off the hemoglobin, it dissociates. Another word for this though is loading. So another word for association is loading, and the dissociation is unloading. So here's a particular exam question. The diagram shows a molecule of hemoglobin. Here's the diagram. The question says, what is the evidence from the diagram that hemoglobin has a quaternary structure? So by looking at this diagram, you need to describe what you can see to answer this question. Well, what you can see in the diagram is that you've got these multiple structures that are connected together, and each of these structures is a polypeptide chain. So that will be the answer to that question. So the evidence for this quaternary structure is that you've got multiple polypeptide chains that are bind together. You've also got these oxygen binding sites there that give you that idea that there's these heme groups. Okay. So if you go on to the next one. Right, so we know that hemoglobin is a quaternary structure. It's got 4 polypeptides linked together. That was the answer to the previous question. There is an ion that's there, Fe2+, and when it binds onto the oxygen, it makes oxyhemoglobin. Hemoglobin then, it readily associates with oxygen, and then it will dissociate with oxygen when it's in the low oxygen area. This word here, affinity is this word. It means oxygen likes to join onto it. Affinity means like it likes it, it wants it. Okay, so oxygen has an affinity. So hemoglobin has an affinity for oxygen. Now, where will it have a higher affinity and where will it have a lower affinity? So if you move on to the next one, when oxygen enters the lungs, there will be a high oxygen concentration in the lungs. So oxygen will readily associate or load onto the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. So high oxygen content in the lungs. And then when it goes to respiring tissue, where there is very little oxygen, because the cells are using it for aerobic respiration, oxygen will dissociate or unload so that the oxygen will go into the cells. Okay, so that's what happens. That's what we've looked at in the last lesson. And in the lungs, you get a high concentration of oxygen. We call this, another word for this is we say partial pressure of oxygen. Now, why partial pressure? Because the atmosphere is actually, well, there's 100% of air, but in that air, 4/5 of the air is nitrogen. So the pressure on you right now, 4/5 of that pressure is due to the nitrogen, but 1/5 of that pressure is due to the oxygen. That's why we call it partial pressure. Okay, but it's ultimately what it means is the amount of oxygen, the concentration of oxygen. So the more oxygen you've got, the higher partial pressure of oxygen, because 1/5 of the air is oxygen. Okay. So this exam question, hemoglobin in one organism may have a different chemical structure from the hemoglobin in another organism. Describe how. So this is a question where you're just describing, so you don't need to actually go into the explanation why would a different organism have different hemoglobin, not the reason behind it, but why would it have a different structure. So the hemoglobin is a quaternary structure, so you've got single polypeptide chains joined together. So here then, how would it be different? You must have different sequence of amino acids, so the polypeptide chains must be different somehow. Okay, so the answer to those two exam questions then. The first one was, how can you tell from that diagram that it was a quaternary structure? The marking, it's got more than one polypeptide chain that's joined together. And the question that we just saw, it must have a different amino acid sequence or different polypeptide chains joined together. That's why they've got different hemoglobin. Now, we discussed this earlier in the previous lesson, that why would different organisms have different hemoglobins? Well, it must be something to do with their adaptations, because not all organisms are exactly the same. Some organisms may live like under the soil, like worms. Some organisms might be up in the mountains where there's low oxygen down there as well, or, you know, so depending on the organism, the different adaptations, they may have different types of hemoglobin, some that have a higher affinity for oxygen, some that might have a lower affinity for oxygen. Now, this leads us on to this concept of loading and unloading. So loading is when oxygen is associated with the hemoglobin, and unloading is where the oxygen molecule comes off. But why does that happen? Now, from the previous slide, where we had it on the initial slide where the hemoglobin kept opening and closing, is to do with that. So in the beginning, when there's very little oxygen about, the hemoglobin molecule actually closes up. And as it closes up, it makes it very difficult for the oxygen to get to the hemoglobin molecules. And when one oxygen molecule binds to that first hemoglobin molecule, the hemoglobin molecule actually opens up and exposes the other hemoglobin molecules, therefore making it easier to associate or to load up. Okay, so then they'll quickly load up. Eventually, as all the oxygen starts to load up, it becomes very difficult to find out those last few, so it becomes more and more difficult to load up. Now, if we go on to the next slide, we can see, we can represent that with this particular graph. This is called an oxygen dissociation curve. Now, it's a very strange kind of graph, because if you think about chemistry, along the x-axis here, I've got the oxygen partial pressure. So we say either pp or just PO2, and it's got it in millimeters of mercury. That's just a unit of pressure. So this is showing us the pressure of oxygen. Now, why is it calling it partial pressure? Coming back to the idea. This just ultimately means the concentration of oxygen that's available. But it's called it partial pressure because the air is only 1/5 oxygen. This tells us about the saturation of oxygen. How much oxygen is saturated? How much oxygen is loaded onto the hemoglobin? Now, if you look, if it was chemistry, if you increase the concentration, then the rate of reaction or the loading, what you should get usually is a directly proportional graph. It should just go up like that in a straight line like this. But this doesn't do that. If you notice, it's a funny S-shaped curve. Okay, so we call this S-shape sigmoid. It's a sigma curve there. It's like an S-shaped curve. So why doesn't it just go up straight, like a straight line? And the reason behind that, why it doesn't go up a straight line, is because the hemoglobin molecule changes shape. Okay, so at the beginning, when we're in low partial pressure of oxygen, so here we've got very, very low partial pressure of oxygen. So here would be like your respiring tissues. For instance, your legs, you're running, oxygen's being used up by your respiring tissues, like your muscles. So the amount of oxygen available is very, very low. So here, the hemoglobin molecule is closed up, which means oxygen doesn't want to load. It's got a low affinity for oxygen. Oxygen is actually unloading. It's giving the oxygen to the muscle cells so then they can respire and use that oxygen. So what happens as you increase the amount of oxygen? So if I increase the partial pressure of oxygen, initially it's very difficult for the oxygen to get on. That's why there's a slight flattening of the curve there. And then as you suddenly one oxygen binds onto it, it opens up. It's like that flower we talked about earlier. The flowering shape kind of opens up and exposes the other hemoglobin molecules. So therefore, there's a rapid increase in the amount of oxygen that can associate or load onto the hemoglobin molecule. Okay, so initially a slow uptake because it's very difficult to find those hemoglobin molecules. As soon as you open up, you get a rapid exponential rise, very, very quick rise, but then suddenly it starts to curve off and it starts to plateau. It never quite reaches 100%. Why? Because no matter how much I start to increase the amount of oxygen, so here, very slight increase in the amount of oxygen and you get a rapid uptake, okay? But then suddenly it starts to plateau. Why? Because trying to find that last oxygen molecule is trying to find that last hemoglobin molecule when there's so much of the oxygen already taken up. It's very difficult, so you don't quite hit 100%. Okay? So here, as we're going up the curve, we're associating with oxygen, we're loading up. So if I'm going down the slide, if I'm coming down to low partial pressures, I'm dissociating. And that's kind of a strange thing, because when we talk about graphs, you always think about, you always read a graph from left to right. So actually what's happening as you're going up, you're associating, but we don't call it an oxygen association curve. We call it an oxygen dissociation curve. Okay? So you need to be able to describe and explain what this graph is showing. So as you increase partial pressure of oxygen, the hemoglobin readily associates as you go up the curve. But it's not a straight line. And the reason behind that is because the hemoglobin changes shape. At the beginning it's difficult for the oxygen to bind on. Eventually it's easier because it opens up, but then it makes it difficult again. Okay, so that's known as a oxygen dissociation curve. So if you go on to the next slide, this is from your textbook, your Caboodle textbook. It's exactly the same graph, but it's easier to read from this one. So here's your partial pressure of oxygen. You can see between 0 and 4, okay, kilopascals. So the old units were millimeters of mercury. You can use this unit for pressure, it's kilopascals. 4 kilopascals of pressure, you've got 25% saturation. But if I go up from 4 to 7 there, so I'm not quite doubled, okay, but I've got 50% extra. So that's not doubled, or nearly doubled, but this has more than, that's like 25%, and it's gone up to 75%, so it's doubled and doubled again. Okay, so you've got a whole lot more saturation by not even doubling there, because it's exponentially rising here, but then it starts to flatten out. Okay, so that's the same graph that we saw before. So this is the reason why it happens. So it's very difficult at the beginning to load up, makes it very easy to load up, and then makes it more difficult to load up again. What I'll do is I'll show my homework. Obviously I'll load up this video, but I'll load up the PowerPoint to go with it for you to have a go at. And we'll go on to the next slide. Now, the next thing, what we've got here, this is something called the Bohr shift. The Bohr shift, the Bohr effect. Okay, this is not me boring you to death. Thank you.
That was funny stuff.
Okay, biding my time for the first joke. Right, so this thing here is called the Bohr effect. What we've got, if you imagine the blue one is your normal line that we just were talking about, the oxygen dissociation curve. What you've got, the green line, shows you if you increase the amount of carbon dioxide. Okay? Now, where in your body would you find more carbon dioxide?
Muscle.
Muscles. So in your muscles, you get more carbon dioxide because they're respiring, because they're very, very active, because you're running or something like that, running away from coronavirus.
So that was funny.
Right. So if you got more carbon dioxide, this whole shift, the oxygen dissociation curve, it shifts to the right. Why is it shifting to the right? So if it's shifted to the right, is it making it harder or easier for oxygen to associate, to load up? If it's shifted to the right.
It's making it harder.
Harder, well done, right. So if it goes to the right, it's making it more difficult, because if you go up this way, it's got higher ppO2 of oxygen, more partial pressure of oxygen, to get the same amount compared to the blue line. So carbon dioxide makes it harder to associate, and therefore vice versa, it's making it easier to dissociate. So it's harder to load on, but easier to unload. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
What do you mean by carbon dioxide is harder to associate with what?
So carbon dioxide makes the oxygen dissociation curve shift. Yeah. The whole shift, that blue line is shifted to the green line. So our blue line has now moved to where the green line is. Carbon dioxide is making it more difficult for oxygen to load on, but easier for it to unload. And that's a useful thing because your muscles are needing oxygen. They don't want the blood to hold on to the oxygen. They want the blood to give the oxygen to the muscles so they can use that for aerobic respiration because you're running. Does that make sense? Right? So it's making shifting to the right. So by shifting to the right, so carbon dioxide, this is called the Bohr shift or the Bohr effect, B-O-H-R, which you'll see in a second. It shifts it to the right, so therefore it's easier to let go of the oxygen, but harder to hold on to it. Okay? However, if I reduce, come back to that. Why does that do that? Why does carbon dioxide do that? Well, what does carbon dioxide do when it's in solution? When it's in water, what does it do to the pH? It brings it down. It lowers the pH, it makes it more acidic. And if it's more acidic, okay, that's going to affect that shape. So the oxygen likes to open up like this. The hemoglobin likes to open up like that. No. But if you make it acidic, it affects those bonds, so it closes it up. So therefore, if it's closed, it's harder to load. So it's harder to associate. So it's easier to unload and dissociate the oxygen. So therefore, oxygen comes off the hemoglobin and then the muscles will use that oxygen. Okay? Vice versa then, what happens if there's low carbon dioxide? So if there's very, very little carbon dioxide, the oxygen dissociation curve will shift to the left. Now if it's to the left, it's going to make it easier to associate because it shoots up quicker than the blue line. So it will readily hold on to the oxygen because it's got a high affinity for the oxygen. It wants to hold on to the oxygen, which makes the opposite. It makes it harder for the oxygen to dissociate. Okay, so it doesn't unload. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
So if we move on to the next slide. Okay, so that's just giving us the information, the notes on that, about the affinity. So carbon dioxide will shift the dissociation curve to the right. Okay, the higher the carbon dioxide, the more it will shift to the right, making it harder to associate, i.e. load on. It will make it easier to dissociate and unload the oxygen, ready for tissues that are respiring. And that's why carbon dioxide is important. And it's because of the acidity of carbon dioxide. It lowers the pH because it makes it into carbonic acid, the hydrogen ions, affecting those bonds, and then the hemoglobin molecule will close up. Okay? So if we go, oops, I want to take this out. Right, so this is the same thing we were just talking about. It's called the Bohr effect. It's this dissociation curve. It shifts to the left if it's low carbon dioxide, and it shifts to the right when it's high carbon dioxide. There you go, it added some special effects. Okay, so that's called the Bohr effect. I will post this on Show My Homework so you can get your notes done. Okay, so we move on to the next one. We're going to look at how this is important for different organisms, different animals and stuff. Okay, so that's why when we finished the last lesson, that exam question we finished on was like, well, why do animals have different types of hemoglobin? What's the point of it? Why don't we all have exactly the same? It's just to do with adaptation. Where do you live? Where does the organism live? What kind of ecosystem is it? All right, so we're going to look at that. We're going to apply the knowledge about this to different situations. So this is just purely on the normal oxygen dissociation curve. What does carbon dioxide do? Very little carbon dioxide shifts it to the left, and higher carbon dioxide will shift it to the right. And we looked at the advantages of that. The advantage of that is that it makes it easier to get rid of that carbon dioxide so that the cells can get more oxygen because they need it for aerobic respiration. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. And here's an example then. This is cut straight from your caboodle textbook. So the red line represents the human hemoglobin, our hemoglobin, okay, our normal oxygen dissociation curve, that little sigmoid S-shaped curve. Okay, we talked about why it's not a straight line. But here's another animal, a lugworm. Any ideas what a lugworm is? It's a worm, right? It's a worm, not the one that you see on the field, under the soil. It's actually, you see it under the sand. So if you go to the beach, There will be, sometimes when you're on the beach you see little curvy bits of sand sort of like spiral around, and you think, where did that come from? Well, the worms must have come up at some point and then go back down, they leave a little spiral, little sand, okay? Now, with these lugworms, they live under the sand. So, lugworms then, let's think about their adaptations. If they're under the sand, is there a lot of oxygen around there?
No.
No, so there's very little oxygen around there.
No.
Now, are they very quick? Have you ever seen a fast-moving worm?
No.
No, they're very slow. So will they have high metabolic rates? No. So they've got very slow metabolic rates. Will they need a lot of oxygen? No. So this dissociation curve then is shifted all the way to the left. Is it easier to associate or dissociate this curve? So if I increase the partial pressure of oxygen, is it loading? So if I increase the oxygen, is it going? Yeah. So it readily associates to load up a very little partial pressure of oxygen. Look, for humans, okay, if you read this line, that's 2. So at 2 kilopascals of the partial pressure of oxygen, humans have 10% saturation. But look at this for the lugworm, 90%. 90% saturation. That means that there's so little oxygen. The lugworm grabs onto that oxygen, holds onto it. Okay? So it can take oxygen when it's very low, which it is under the sand. Okay? So it hasn't got much oxygen about. And remember, they've got like moist skin, so they can absorb the oxygen from their surroundings. Okay? They don't have like lungs like us. Okay? Then, the opposite then. So here, loads of oxygen. It'll hold onto its oxygen, hold onto its oxygen, hold onto its oxygen, hold onto its oxygen, hold onto its oxygen. Suddenly, very little oxygen around. If there's very little oxygen around, it'll give up its oxygen. So when you're here at 1, 30%. When you're at 0.5, that's when you're at 10%.
Wait, so why can't you take oxygen like really fast? But why does it take so much of it?
Because there's very little about, because it's under the sand. Because it's under the sand, there's very little oxygen about, so it wants to hold on to it, because it knows there's not much oxygen about. Because the water could come in and completely block the sand, and then there'll be no water about. So no oxygen about. So there's very little oxygen under there. It wants to hold on to it. It doesn't need to does it need to give that oxygen to the cells all the time? No, because it's not moving about. It's very still. Okay, so it's very docile, very still. It's not moving around a lot. It doesn't really need to release all that energy from aerobic respiration. But obviously it still needs to move, so it needs to release some of that energy because it needs to get its food. Okay, so that's why this dissociation curve is to the left, Everything here is to the left. Thank you, another joke. Right, okay. So this dissociation goes to the left. Okay, now I want you to work out the next bunch of animals that come up. I want you to think, where is it going to shift? Is it going to shift to the left, or is it going to shift to the right? Okay, so that's a lugworm. So think about, what you need to think about is its surface area to volume ratio. How does it get the oxygen in there? Think about its metabolism, right? Does it have a fast metabolism or a slow metabolism? Does it move really fast, or does it move really slow? Think about where it lives. Does it live somewhere where it's got very little oxygen, or is it living somewhere where there's loads of oxygen? Okay, so think about those things. All right, and think about where is it going to shift? Is it going to shift, compared to the human one,
left.
Is it going to shift to the left, or to the right? So lugworms to the left. Here's the next animal. So the next animal is a llama. Yeah. So where does a llama live?
High altitude.
High altitude. What do you know about high altitude?
Low oxygen.
Low oxygen. So there's very little oxygen about.
Therefore it's going to shift to the left.
Well done. So it's going to shift to the left. So if we look at the llama, on the next slide I think there's a picture. Right, so it's got a higher affinity for the oxygen. So therefore it's going to be shifted to the left. You're right. So on the next slide it should hopefully show us the human one there. There's your llama. I knew there was a slide on the llama. Look, the llama's got a higher affinity for the oxygen. So it's shifted to the left. Okay, to the left. What about a little mouse? Okay, a little scurrying around little mouse. Okay.
Has a low surface area to volume ratio.
Does it? It's very
Well,
small.
high.
Large surface area.
It's correct. So a little mouse has got very large surface area to volume ratio. So any heat it generates, where's it going to go?
Out.
Out. Right? So it can't get cold really quick. That's why it's got a furry body. Right? So if you're going to lose the heat, do you need to generate more heat?
No.
Yeah.
Because you're losing it so quick.
Yeah.
If you're losing it so quick, you need to keep making more of it. So what's that? What does that tell you about its metabolism and its respiration rate?
Of a mouse, it's high.
high. Right, a mouse is hot. If you ever feel a mouse is hot, I don't know if you feel a mouse is hot, but if you've got a mouse who's hot, you're beating really fast. Like if you get rabbits, you get little animals, the hearts beat really, really, really quick, right? Because they've got a very fast metabolism, they've got high respiration rates. So the mouse needs to generate high respiration, so high respiration rate. So does it want to give the oxygen to the cells quickly, or does it want to keep on to it?
It wants to keep on the oxygen.
Does it want to keep on to the
it wants to
oxygen?
get rid of it.
It wants to get rid of it. It wants to give the cells oxygen really, 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 really quickly, right? So if it wants to do that, does it want to have a high affinity or low affinity for oxygen? Low, because affinity means liking, it wants to stick onto it. Affinity means to grab, to like, to hold onto it, right? Because you like it. So, affectionate, like affinity. So, it's going to have a low affinity. So, is the dissociation curve going to be to the left or to the right of the humans?
To the right.
To the right. See, here you go. The mouse got a high surface area to volume ratio, generates lots of heat. It's going to get cold really quickly. It needs to keep generating that heat. Has the mouse got an issue with getting oxygen? Has it got a shortage of oxygen in the air? No, it's running around, there's plenty of air around you. It's not living underground, under the soil or anything. So it's got plenty of air, it's not living at high altitude, got plenty of oxygen, so it doesn't need to worry about the amount of oxygen that's about. What it needs to worry about is getting that oxygen to the muscle cells because it's running around really, really fast, generating all sorts of energy, dissipating all that energy. So therefore it's shifted to the right. So it's easier to dissociate, because as you come down, it's easier to let go of it. The llama's on the left.
So can you move a bit to the side so I can see the mouse?
The mouse is to the right.
So it's...
Because look, it's shifted to the right. So if I go up the PPO2 at 5, the mouse is there, and the human's up here. So humans have got a greater affinity for the oxygen. Okay? Right, let's think of some other examples then. So,
Cats.
the cat that's chasing the mouse. I'll give you let's think of the examples, right? So the other example is a bird, right? A bird flying through the air, flappy, flappy, right? So, is it using lots of energy, flapping its wings, right? Does it have a problem with the amount of air it's got?
No.
No, right? So it needs to get, why does it need lots of oxygen?
Because it's using its wings constantly.
It's using its wings constantly to fly. That muscle must be getting loads of oxygen to respire, to beat its wings so it can fly. If it stops flapping, it's going to fall.
Wait, I have a question, because like on the birds when we flying at a high altitude.
Correct, but that's like really, really high altitude into the mountains, right? So if you think about here, if a bird is flying from a tree up to the top of the building, it's not exactly high altitude. So there's plenty of air about, okay? Those birds that live very, very high altitude, like big eagles and stuff like that, they'd have special adaptations so they can get more oxygen from the lack of oxygen up there. But generally speaking, a bird will be shifted to the right because it requires to give out more oxygen to the cells because it's respiring a lot more. Okay. All right. What about? Okay, I'm going to use two types of fish. So the first fish is going to be. Have you heard of a place? P-L-I-C-E.
Yeah.
Actually, in the Grand Central, they got that tasty place.
Yeah,
there you
that's
go.
what I thought.
The word place means it's a fish. It's a flat fish. Okay. It's what we call a bottom feeder. Okay. Not that it feeds on bottoms. What that means is it stays right on the seabed, stays on the seabed and doesn't move. Right, it's camouflaged on the top. It just lies there and eats things off the bottom. Okay, on the seabed. So is it moving a lot? No. So does it have a high metabolism?
No.
No. So its oxygen dissociation curve, if you think about fish, is going to be shifted to the left or to the right?
To the left.
To the left. Well done. So you've got this now. You've got the idea. So if it's not moving around quickly, if it doesn't need that much oxygen, it's going to have a higher affinity, so it's going to shift to the left because it'll give off the oxygen very slowly.
What animal is this?
This was a place. Any fish that's sort of flat, those flat fish that live on the bottom feeders. Okay? But then your other fish, like marlin, like those swordfish, or mackerel and sardines and things like that, the ones that you cut for your dissection. So those swim really fast through the water, right? Compared to the flatfish, is it going to be shifted to the left or to the right? To the right, well done. Why?
Because its metabolic rate is increased.
That's it, its metabolic rate is much faster. It's using its muscles to swim faster through that water. It requires more oxygen. The gills have to try to get as much oxygen out of that water as possible. The haemoglobin is going to be shifted, well done, to the right. One last one. There's actually, one or two last ones from. This is within humans then. Within humans, we kind of mentioned this last lesson. If I've got a baby growing inside of me, obviously I don't. I can't. If I did, if I was a woman, I'm not. But if I was, the fetal hemoglobin, the fetal hemoglobin. Remember, there's a placenta inside. The mum's blood never comes into contact with the baby's blood, but it comes very, very, very close. All right. And the oxygen diffuses across the membranes through the capillaries and into the baby's blood, and the carbon dioxide goes from baby's blood into mother's blood. But babies don't breathe. They're not using their lungs to breathe the oxygen in. So how do they get the oxygen? It's through the diffusion through the placenta. So it's basically what the mum's got in her blood will get given to the baby. And that's why you see mums, pregnant mums, heavily pregnant mums, always out of breath. Why? Because sometimes they're climbing the stairs, obviously, they might be tired because they're carrying an extra weight. So imagine carrying 2 bags of sugar on your front and walking around with it. Okay, so they get quite tiring afterwards, and it's going to cause you back pain and stuff like that. But also, the baby is like a little parasite. It's taking the oxygen from the mum. It's like a little baby growing inside of you. It's stealing the oxygen from the mum. So if it's stealing oxygen from the mum, has it got a higher affinity for the oxygen or a lower affinity compared to the mum?
Compared to the mum, they don't have higher.
Higher, well done. It's got a higher affinity. So if you imagine that's not the llama, that's the mum, the fetal hemoglobin will be like this one here. It's shifted to the left of the mum's because it's got a higher affinity. It's literally stealing oxygen from the mum's blood. Right? So mum, because the baby's got no other way to get the oxygen. It can't get it, it can't breathe, so it's going to steal it from the mum's blood. So mum needs to take in more oxygen into her blood, so she's going to have to take deeper breaths. But it's shifted to the left. Other type of hemoglobin, I mentioned this in the previous lesson, the myoglobin, that's in your calf muscles, where you're running and you're running and you're running and you're running and you're suddenly running out of oxygen, okay, and your legs are going to pack in and you're going to cave in. That last little bit of oxygen that you've got left is kept in a special type of hemoglobin called myoglobin. And the dissociation curve looks very similar to the lugworm that we saw on the previous slide. I won't go back because of the sound effects. Right? It's all the way over here, and it goes like this, like that. That's myoglobin. It's another type of hemoglobin that's got a very, very high affinity for the oxygen. It holds on to it until the last second, until the PPA is so low, the oxygen concentration, the partial pressure is so low, that it says, right, okay, here, have the last bit of oxygen. And once you've used up all of that, you'll just collapse. That's it, game over. Okay, so like try and do a marathon or something. Okay, so to finish off, we've got a short little video clip that you can watch. Press play. So this is what we were talking about. This is the mouse, and this is the human. And I think that might be the last one. There's the worms. And I actually did get shot there, that pigeon there, the bird. We talked about the bird. That's to the right. Okay, right. What's the next one? I think that's the end of your lesson. If you like this and it's been useful, click like.